For those of you who are here to see the pre-screen of Black Panther, you're going to be totally disappointed. But if you're game for learning about some new things about why design has really been one of the most important things of the last few years of startups and will continue to be that way, then settle in, grab some popcorn, and hopefully have a good time here. So I'm a general partner at Foundation Capital. We're an early stage venture firm based here in Palo Alto. But in a former life, I was actually a product designer at a company called IDEO, where I built everything from anesthesia delivery devices to, it sounds like we have some mic issues. Are we good? You guys hear me?
Yep.
Great, cool. So I started my career at this firm called IDEO, and I worked on everything from furniture to anesthesia delivery devices to the last great desk phone. Now, after more than half a decade at IDEO, I wanted to do more than just pure craft. So I wanted to actually get on the path to starting a company. Now, at the time, there were just not that many resources out there for designers who actually wanted to become founders. But I was... All right, great. So, but I was lucky, and I found some great mentors, as you heard from other folks, and eventually found my way. So, when I meet young designers today, I'm actually struck by the fact that so many of them are still struggling with some of the same things that I struggled with 20 years ago when I left my career at IDEO. Because there just aren't a whole lot of resources out there for folks who actually want to figure out how to go from being a designer or a creative to becoming a startup founder, a successful founder. There are lots of sort of very high-level industry reports with statistics and things like that, but not a lot of practical bits, not really substantive insight about what's required to become that founder. So I decided I wanted to do something about this. So I wrote this book. It's called The Way to Design. You can actually read or download it for free over at thewaytodesign.com, or you can get a hard copy if you must have one of those at Amazon. And it's really a guidebook that does three things. So the first thing is really about how to go from being a designer or creative to a designer founder. The second is how to kind of create a design-led organization. And then the third is how to use design to have real and meaningful impact in the world. Now, to write the book, I actually spoke with 50 designers, designer founders, design scholars, and historians. And what I want to do today is just really kind of walk you through what I learned from that experience. Now, let me start really quickly with a brief history of how design got to where it is today. When I started as that product designer that you saw in the machine shop on High Street in Palo Alto, design just wasn't held in very high regard. In fact, the founder of IDEO, David Kelly, used to make this point that the designers were usually brought in to make what the engineers had already conceived of, to make it look pretty. So design was sort of this afterthought if it was a thought at all. Success, instead, was actually a function of an organization's technical prowess, so that it have this, sort of ruthless focus on performance and computing dominance, if you will. And what really mattered about those experiences with end consumers was that they be fast, or in some cases just layered and with layers and layers upon features. Now, things have really changed. They've changed actually dramatically in the last 2 decades. And what used to be last, this sort of bolt-on, is now first. Now, why is that? So if you look at what's going on in technology, we're reaching this sort of equilibrium point. In fact, after dining on Moore's Law for more than 4 decades, we're starting to see the asymptotes, right? So even if we actually, eke out another 10 years of this, which we probably will, it's decelerating, both in performance as well as time, and then we make the shift to quantum computing, it's absolutely the case that the most basic software infrastructure for all the companies that you guys will start or have been inside of has really become commoditized. It's just, you can tilt up a website on Amazon in seconds, and the marginal cost of software is zero, and the vast majority of the differentiation is actually now happening through design. So the second thing that's really changed is this notion of consumer expectations. So it used to be that businesses were not punished if they had a weak emphasis on design. You could actually still sell millions of units of crummy products with just great distribution or great sales and marketing. But I think those days are numbered. And that's really thanks to people like David Kelly or Steve Jobs or Hartmut Esslinger, who really radically changed the way consumers expect to interact with technology. They have much, much higher expectations now. Now, the iPhone here, which recently sold its 1.2 billionth unit and celebrated its 10th anniversary or birthday last summer, is already the most successful product in human history. But the reason it is so important is actually it's had the greatest impact on increasing users' expectations for delightful to use, really sort of beautifully designed products. And that sort of pervades everything we do, not just the thing in our pocket, but what our expectations are when we go to get healthcare or our kids' education or all these other areas. So for average consumers, design is now non-negotiable. So there's a third and final reason why design has really come into the fore over the last few years here in Silicon Valley, and that's that the actual definition of what design is has actually changed. So it used to be the case, if I told you I was a product designer, you might think that I was picking the drapes or the drop shadows in an interface, that it was very sort of aesthetically oriented, sort of very superficial things. But design goes much, much further beyond these sort of pixels and elegant edges. And in my book, one of the things that I do pretty early on is I redefine design as the what. What problem are you going to go after? What opportunity are you going to address? What positive change do you want to affect in the world? So in a world in which anything can be built, the onus actually for entrepreneurs, the burden has actually shifted for figuring out if you can actually build something to actually determining whether it should be built in the first place. Or as Evan Sharp, who's a co-founder of Pinterest, says here, where engineering is all about capability, what we could do, design is all about suitability, what we should do. So design, sort of at its highest level, really is this messy, holistic, human-attuned process for solving problems of all manner and level of importance. And really the way you should think about it as designers serve as this bridge, this very important bridge between the user, the technology, and the business. And these three developments that I just talked about, they're really what are leading to what I think about as this moment for design, where design is sort of more important than it has ever been. And it really is the best time in history to be a designer. Now, on the ground, the number of venture-backed startups that are founded by designers has been exploding. This is from 2005 to 2015, so it doesn't account for the last few years. But what is absolutely the case is that these designers are moving from 11th hour stylists to ground zero founders. And that is why I believe that design really will be the greatest lever to build the greatest companies of our time. And that means that the core value creation is not flowing from an unimpeachable technical founder, but rather from someone, an entrepreneur, who has a deeper, more intuitive sense for the human condition, people with empathy for users. And that means we are going to need more designers who know how to start companies. And we also need more technology and business founders, for those of you in the room, who actually really understand design. So, what is it going to take for all of you who care about these things to have this vision come to pass? What do you need to do, specifically you? And how are you going to level up? So in the book, I actually talk about kind of these three different frames. This notion of leveling up at the individual level, at the organizational level, and at the global level. So let me start with the individual level. So in my book, I actually break down 5 things that individuals actually need to do to level up. I want to bounce through those, and I'm going to actually use some of the stories from the 50 people that I interviewed. Starting with this idea of thinking big. So whether you're a designer or a business person or a technical person, it's absolutely the case that there's this natural gravitational pull to the details. If it's a designer, you're maybe thinking about pixels, or you're a business person, you're deep in the spreadsheet macros, you're doing do loops with your with your software. But that's absolutely how most products are created. Like, you actually have to be in the weeds to be able to solve a problem. But there is something else that I think you need to do, which is zoom back out. So the story of Nate Weiner, which is this company, was founded. We're going to talk, actually, Nate, on one of the other stages in another hour or so. But Nate started this company called Pocket. And Pocket was this sort of DVR for your content. And when he started Pocket, He was actually solving a very personal problem. And you guys probably think about entrepreneurship in this way in many ways. In fact, what he was doing was he was a designer who was actually trying to teach himself how to code. He was working for this creative agency in Minneapolis. And he started emailing himself all of these links, tutorials and all this stuff that he actually wanted to read when he wasn't at work. And what he found was all this stuff was getting lost in his inbox. So he wrote this little JavaScript plugin to Firefox. It was 160 lines of code. And he shared it with a few of his friends and had two features. It basically said save and read later. It was really simple. And he shared it with a few folks. And then 3 months later, it got picked up by Lifehacker. And it exploded from there. And I met Nate a couple months after this. In fact, at a Stanford D School event. And here's a slide that I actually recently dug up from his original presentation. And this is always kind of a dangerous thing. CEOs don't like it when you show them slides of all the things they were going to do. But what I think is so interesting about this is what started out as 160 lines of this lightweight kind of browser plugin turned into this much, much larger thing. And Nate had to sort of stay close to this project and sort of see that there was something bigger going on. In fact, what he discovered was it wasn't just about these articles, actually also about podcasts and videos and all this other kind of content. And it wasn't just in the US, it was actually all over the world. And ultimately, about saving content, it was actually also about sharing the stuff that you really liked with other people. And it's this kind of expansionist thinking that enables you as a creative, as a product person, to go from 160 lines of code to a service that is literally being used by tens of millions of people today. Now, but one thing when Nate would absolutely tell you, he would probably even say this today, is when he started Pocket, he didn't know a thing about business. And that's why it's incumbent upon technologists and designers and even like freshly minted MBAs to really get smart on business, which is the second point in the book here. So when I used to be at IDEO, David Kelly, the founder again, he used to say this thing, which is the best design wins. And I believe that for the vast majority of my time there, and even for a long time afterwards. But I also remember that as a product designer, I felt pretty uncomfortable when the conversation would shift away from the things I knew around the products, and it shifted to things like customer acquisition cost or amortization of fixed costs or how are you going to actually think about building out your network. And I knew that these concepts weren't actually technically that hard. I had a very technical background, but I just hadn't given myself the time or the space to get smart on them. So YC didn't exist at the time, so I decided to go to business school. And here is how I described what I wanted to do in business school. And this is back this is in 2001. This is literally pulled from my business school application to Stanford. And for those of you who maybe recognize the similarities to the D School, this was like 3 or 4 years before the D School was started. But what this Venn diagram really captures is something very simple, which was I was very comfortable designing products that met users' desires and needs, this sort of circle in the upper left. And I, as a former roboticist, was very comfortable actually designing products that had a high degree of technical content in them. But this other circle of business needs, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't understand business models. I sort of shied away from those conversations. Now, even as an investor today, I still meet entrepreneurs who walk in and don't actually have a fundamental sense of the mechanics of their business, the details of the business. They haven't asked themselves or their teams the hardest questions. They don't understand what their LTV to CAC is, or they don't even understand why the LTV to CAC ratio might actually be pretty misleading and can be highly manipulated. And these are the same kind of situations that get entrepreneurs into trouble where they might optimize a financing around something that they think is really important to the outside world, like my valuation, and not pay attention to like the subtle terms that might actually turn you as an owner of a business upside down if for whatever reason you sort of don't meet your milestones and things don't go well. So in any case, if any of this business stuff sounds foreign to you, I would say go wrestle it to the ground. Really, it's sort of for the health of your startup and certainly for the health of your own self-interest. Get smart on business. But I would say don't forget, even in all of that, that design really will be that key differentiator for the next generation of companies to come. And the only way that your startup can be one of those special companies that sort of really embraces this is if you embrace design. Now, I understand, and I work with a lot of CEOs, and I understand how all these other things can begin to kind of take on a life of their own. They can begin to crowd out design. The pressure of what you told your board members at your last board meeting, this sort of notion of sort of growth at any cost. So there's a lot of ways that businesses can kind of lose focus on design. But I think it's really important that you keep that little flame sort of alive and you figure out how to scale it. Now, case in point, one of the designers who I actually interviewed for the book, he was one of the co-founders. He has two other engineers with him. He talked about the insidious influence of the sales culture once they launched the product and became addicted to the intoxicating growth of sales and discovered that, oh, wow, this role that I had in this company, this super important creative role, kept getting smaller and more diminished with every quarter. And he ultimately was pushed out of that company. So you have to let design continue to be in your company. And when I interviewed Joe Gebbia, the co-founder of Airbnb for the book, he talked about this turning point where when he and Brian Chesky, his co-founder, really figured out what was going on with what they were doing. They were actually, the company was kind of like borderline going out of business. And what he discovered was the dogma in Silicon Valley around how to kind of code your way out of all your problems was actually wrong. And Joe is a designer by training, as is his co-founder, Brian. And what they did is they said, hey, we're human-centered designers, first and foremost. Let's go get close to our customers. So they went to New York on this trip. They met with these hosts. And all these things that they thought were really easy, that looked like took 2 clicks, actually turned out to take 12 clicks. And then what they discovered was, oh, if we have these really beautiful photographs and pithy descriptions of these properties, that actually is going to dramatically improve how they get how they're listed in their attractiveness. And what they then ultimately discovered was, oh, all of this isn't about this kind of like transitory hoteling platform. It's actually about trust. Trust between the hosts and the renters, and ultimately trust in the Airbnb platform itself. So it's a really important point there. So you all have heard about this concept of the minimum viable product. Any of you have not heard about this in the room? All right, maybe one or two. But what I want to tell you about here, and this is one of those sort of pieces of Silicon Valley dogma that I don't believe in anymore. And in fact, Joe completely outright rejects this construct. Joe thinks about product launches the same way he thinks about first dates. And you definitely would not accept minimum viability on a first date, right? Like it's just not good enough. And so when anything goes out the door at Airbnb now, it actually has to be what Joe calls a minimum awesome product. It doesn't mean it has every feature you ever think needs to exist, but it has to be memorable, and it has to be great, and it has to bring people back. And that's what it means to be an advocate for design. So on to my fourth point, this notion of breaking out of the craft box. So if you're going to be running a company, you can't just be a craftsperson. That's not enough. You have to wisely pick and choose when you're going to zoom into the details and when a solution that's not perfect might actually still be good enough to kind of go answer a fundamental question. And this is definitely easier said than done for most founders. In fact, I will tell you of the scores of founders that we interviewed, this was the single greatest failure mode. That kind of tractor beam towards the details. Everyone kind of gets sucked into it, whether you're a designer or oftentimes a business or technical. And you've got to figure out when to let go of that kind of molecular level attention to detail and be able to kind of zoom out. Now, it is one of those things that makes you probably good at what you're doing, but you need to sort of also balance that with some of the greater challenges. So recruiting and hiring, earning sort of more respect with the other stakeholders in your company, figuring out how to boost your organizational credibility, certainly how to facilitate among the various disciplines. These are the things that are going to be really important when you make that transition from designer to founder. And so you've got to kind of fix or figure out that proper ratio of tuning pixels to executing strategy, because your company really is your craft now. Now, Steve Jobs is revered as like the greatest designer founder of all time. And that was in many ways because of how exacting he was about all these details, the type of the wood that's in the store, the fact that there's no visible screws anywhere. And he applied this, of course, to the Gen 1 iPod, which a very close friend of mine and former IDEO pal worked on. And what I think a lot of people oftentimes misunderstand is that it wasn't just about, hey, is this a beautiful product that looks great on a billboard and is easy to use. Jobs actually cared about something that was much more fundamental to the success of that product, because it wasn't the first MP3 player, as you guys know. He cared about the deals that they had to go strike with the music industry, because that fundamentally was more important than any radius or pixel or every detailed choice. And so fact of the matter is, Jobs, the most legendary designer founder of all, wasn't actually a designer. He wasn't a coder. He wasn't really any of those things. He really was a conductor of all of them. And that's what he brought together. And that's what you should be thinking about as you think about kind of going from a creative discipline to a more business founder one. So that last point, I think, brings me now to this next level that you're going to need to level up and raise your game. And that's at the organizational level. Now, even though I've been focusing on sort of these individual skill sets where you need to sort of to go focus, I would actually think it's really important for you to remember that it's not all about you. In fact, it's not even all about your product. What turns out to matter most, and you'll see some examples from some of the companies, is that a modern company that successfully embraces design actually is building the lightweight methods and processes for many rounds of creative iteration and problem solving and development. In fact, every startup really needs to form that, not one great product, but many rounds of great products. Or what I call in the book, this notion of a system for repeatable genius. Because if there is one overarching theme in the book, it's about scale. It's about how do you scale yourself, how do you scale your organization, how do you scale your sense of what's possible, how do you scale the idea of what it means to design. Now, back at IDEO, we used to display our most treasured products in these glass cases, almost like they were trophies in the front lobby. And we were definitely proud of these designs. They were great. But there is this danger in fetishizing the product. And it gives you this sort of false sense that design is this definite or finite thing. And when in fact, I think what you need to think about is design isn't this thing that can be sort of trapped inside of an artifact. It is absolutely the case that product that you launch with, it's a point, but it's not the point. Which is why I like to say in the book, product market fit is a liquid, not a solid. Now, why is that? Well, it's absolutely the case that achieving product market fit is a hard thing. And by the way, there's a lot of companies that never get there. But it's actually a transitory achievement. It's a false summit of sorts. And that's because the competitive landscape changes, your customers want more, there's new technologies that enable some new functions or features or form factors. And so it's not enough to achieve product market fit. That's actually not the point. What you actually want to achieve is a drumbeat of regular and repeated product market fits. And that is really your job as a design tech leader. So it's this notion of forging that set of standards and that environment in which individuals and teams really can be challenged to care deeply about every facet of the product, and that they reject mediocrity and build this sort of this notion of sort of a repeatable engine for repeatable genius. So as Joe at Airbnb says, this is about building the machine that builds the machine. So this next slide is obviously way too small for any of you to see. But this is an example of some of the very practical, tactical bits that are in the book around what are the things that you need to be worried about at what stage of your company. When you're just a 2 or 3 person startup, you can do things that you can't do when you're 10 people or 30 or 100 or 1,000. And in this, we hit on some of those very, very specific details. And so what I want to talk about lastly is this notion of how design tech leaders are going to need to level up at the global context. So the world has absolutely become much, much more complex and more interconnected just since the turn of the century. So every day we now generate 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. And we're halfway to connecting every person on the planet. In fact, by 2020, 80% of adults will have a smartphone in their back pocket. So we live in this massively connected, very, very complex world, and it's incredibly difficult to live in this world, never mind start a company in this increasingly complex world, because we're affected by all these moving parts. And that's why I think design thinking, which really emphasizes solving problems from a human-centered approach, actually needs to zoom out and look wider at a larger body of thought, which really embraces humanity-centered thinking, and that's this notion of systems thinking. So I'm only going to hit on a couple of elements of systems thinking. Now, this isn't new. There's probably some of you in the room who are familiar with this or have heard of it, but it's had newfound relevance in this sort of big data, everything is connected world. And it really is about this mindset that everything is connected. So what is it exactly? So let me tell you by using this simple model. This is called the iceberg model. At the very top of it is this notion of events. These are the things that happen on a day-to-day basis, sort of the hurly-burly of life. Underneath that, just below the waterline, are patterns. And these are sort of the things that you notice in a repeated way. These are also sort of some of our behavioral memories that result from those sort of repeated interactions with those events above the waterline. And then there are the structures. This is how the system fits together, how the parts all connect. And then underneath all this is our values. This is sort of our mental models for the world, kind of what we wish would be. Now, let me give you an example from my work at Foundation Capital. It's about 6 months old, and it ties to sort of an experience that one of my partners brought up after a Monday presentation, investor presentation, that didn't go as well as we'd hoped. So this was a company that was coming in to present. And it was a bunch of things going on. One of my partners stepped out to go to the washroom. A couple people were on their phones or their laptops. And there was just, a couple people were low energy. And these were, by the way, these were the events that happened. And while we didn't all agree on which of these events was kind of the worst infraction, we all saw a pattern, which was this pattern of inattentiveness, which didn't really connect with our value of caring about entrepreneurs and the entrepreneur's journey. And so by recognizing this pattern, instead of arguing about the events, we actually could start brainstorming around structures, sort of these ideas that we could implement that would enable us to have better meetings going forward. So we did a few things. One, we had this rule, like you literally put your phones and your laptops in a basket, so you can't look at them, under the desk even. And we asked our admin partner to join every meetings to take notes for us. But the single most important thing we did was we literally flipped our day around so that our meetings with these entrepreneurs would actually happen in the mornings when everyone was really high energy instead of after the big lunch and everyone was exhausted. And so what I think this does is demonstrate in a very subtle way, because we've all been victims of bad meetings, I know that, how you can look beyond the sort of reactionary tendencies of events and oftentimes throw those design resources at symptoms instead of zooming out and looking for root causes, which is what this framework really helps you do. Now, there are several other relevant concepts in systems thinking, and I just want to hit on one more, and that's this concept of leverage points. Now, this really pushes designers to think about how different pieces of a system are connected, because it's no longer possible or even really wise for you to start kind of redesigning components of the system or changing things without understanding how that will affect all these other pieces. And the trick here is really to do this with an eye towards these leverage points. I call this the smallest nudge for the greatest effect. Think about it like an acupuncture point where something that like drops into your back somehow solves the problem in your knee. Doesn't make any sense, but of course our bodies are so incredibly networked. Now, the point here is that these subtle changes in a system can oftentimes lead to a very interesting renovation of the whole. And you've got to be tuned into these. You've got to be looking at all the different relationships. Now, let me give you one example where this is true. So if I asked you guys, what is the best designed airline in the industry? My guess is most of you would say Virgin, because, they have that cool video at the beginning. The pilots all wear cool jackets. The lights are pretty cool. But if we were to really look at this from a systems perspective, the answer is unassailably Southwest. And that's because what they discovered was how you load and unload planes. This very subtle, non-obvious thing could actually have a dramatic impact on people basically being able to get in the planes more quickly, have on-time departures, which result in on-time landings, and ultimately result in airlines that people like. And of course, Southwest is one of the safest, but most importantly, in this case, sort of most profitable, consistently profitable airlines in the industry. So let me just wrap with the last slide here. So in writing this book, it was really a manifesto of sorts when I got started. It's literally the folder on my in my Mac is Designer Founder Manifesto. And I would tell you that as the world grows more complex and uncertain, I believe that designers and creatives have both a moral obligation and a unique ability to take on the greatest challenges of our times. To really look at problems of greater consequence rather than bury your heads in the pixelated sand. Now, I realize that probably only a few of you here might actually self-identify as a designer, but if you look at building things with an eye towards creating minimum awesome products, and if you can understand that building a process for repeated excellence is more imperative than any single product, and above all else, if people and an obsessive empathy for improving their lives informs everything that you do, then you're a designer in my book. And I think we need all the designers we can get, because the world is a pretty messed up place, and I believe a key to solving this and getting ourselves out of this mess is design. So let me end with this. When people think of